Good evening. Welcome. I'm Reverend Lara Cowton, and I am the interim minister of the Vancouver Unitarians. We have the privilege of hosting this event this evening from our beautiful sanctuary at the corner of Oak and 49th in Vancouver, and we recognize that this is on the unceded territory of the Musqueam people. With respect for the rights and wisdom of Indigenous people, we acknowledge our harmful colonial histories and present-day implications and responsibility to honor, protect, and sustain this land, and to work as allies and witnesses to the ongoing struggle of Indigenous people. We are grateful for the Indigenous wisdom and worldviews that center the life-sustaining forces of the natural world and the relationships of reciprocity with the land and with people. Vancouver Unitarians are committed to decolonizing our own practices and learning new ways of being in community, in better relationship with the Indigenous people of this land and with the land itself. Thank you. And welcome. Welcome to all of our guests here and the viewers online. There are just a handful of us in the sanctuary, but I know that there are many, many of you out there. We have our special guest with us today, Rabbi Hannah Dresner of Or Shalom Synagogue and of Rabbis Without Borders. And you'll hear more about Rabbi Hannah from our facilitators, Olivia Hall and Michael Clegg, in a little while. And also we have here monitoring the chat for you, so get busy in the chat. We have Yvonne Marcus and John Boyle there to take your comments and ferry your questions to our speakers. The Vancouver Unitarians have a long history of being deeply engaged in environmental issues. With partners from many other traditions and in the larger community, we work hard to address the climate crisis. We're called to this work as people of faith, driven by the principle to affirm and promote the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. Our faith insists that care for the environment is a religious duty. We recognize our mutual responsibility as stewards of our planet and of all living things. So this evening is the third in a series of faith, spirit, and climate dialogue. It's initiated by Vancouver Unitarian Social Justice Team, and I'm delighted to be here with you and with our Social Justice Team representatives this evening. So to all of you here today and to all of you who will be tuning in later after this live broadcast to view the video, we invite you to join in our commitment to climate action. And we welcome you to Mobilizing Faith and Spirit for the Climate Crisis. Welcome, everyone. With that, I'll hand off to Olivia Hall.
Thank you so much, Lara. First, I want to thank all of our attendees and welcome you. I also want to mention our co-sponsors. The Unitarian Church of Vancouver is sponsoring this event, along with our media sponsor, the Thai News, and the Multi-Faith Action Society. I also want to thank UCV volunteers and staff for organizing this event. And I believe that sometime around now, you will be seeing a slide of our future speakers. So take a look at that. We have very exciting speakers coming up. I believe next month, March 9th, will be Sukhvinder Vinay speaking on climate from a Sikh perspective. That will be very exciting. I can't wait to tell you more about our speaker for tonight, but first I'm going to hand things over to Michael.
Thank you very much, Olivia. And just a short explanation as to why this series. Well, it's occurred to us that we're overwhelmed with information about climate change, climate crisis. A huge job to try to sort out fact from fiction and so on. And that related to the question of what's happening with our climate itself. But it occurred to us, of course, that as human beings, we experience climate in terms of anxiety, in terms of hope, we hope, but with the need to remind ourselves about where do we find the resilience to think through as we experience the incredible changing climate dynamics that are around us. What do we look for inside ourselves and outside ourselves for support? Spiritual values, secular values, what might they be? And so the intent of this series is to try to make a contribution to that, to give all of us who are participating a chance to reflect internally ourselves, to reflect on where we are engaged, as many of us are, in climate action issues, but to also explore and understand what contributions different faiths can bring in terms of working this through as well. What are themes that are within a faith itself, and what are the questions that other faiths and their representatives are experiencing in terms of searching to deal with the challenges in climate that we have at the present time. That's the background for the topic, and I must say that the speakers we've had to date, and I know tonight very much so, are contributing substantially, to my understanding certainly, about this topic. And I'm wishing all our audience well, and I'm sure you will enjoy it too, and look forward to receiving your questions at the end of the presentation.
So, now I get to introduce our speaker. Rabbi Hannah Dresner, MFA, comes to the rabbinate as a second career with a background in visual arts as a painter. She also worked in university teaching and ethnographic museum studies. She is multiply ordained through the Aleph Alliance for Jewish Renewal, first as a spiritual director, then as rabbi, and most recently as one of the movement's 6 Dayanim, adjudicators of Jewish law through a Jewish renewal lens. Jewish renewal is part of a paradigm shift rooted in humanity's realization of the unity of life on this planet. Jewish renewal affirm that the fullness of God's image includes all creatures, species, ecosystems, and that all who wound God's works wound God's image. Rabbi Drezner's writing is archived on the My Jewish Learning website, as well as on the website of Or Shalom, the Vancouver Jewish Renewal congregation that she serves as full-time rabbi. Personally, I like their nickname of East Van Shul, but Rabbi Hannah taught me a new one today, Vancouver's Spiritual Playground. Yes, that's a good nickname too. She has been named as a fellow in numerous Jewish leadership organizations, including the Cross-Denominational Rabbis Without Borders, CLI and Kenisa, Incubators for Clergy Agents of Change, and the Institute for Jewish Spiritualities, Hevrea, a cohort of clergy mediators. Meditators. I said mediators, but clergy meditators. Clergy are already mediators half the time, as our own Reverend nods to me. She is married to psychiatrist Ross Andelman and has 3 grown daughters. I want to add on a personal note something that I saw on Or Shalom's website about Rabbi Hannah that I felt really spoke to tonight was the line, "She believes that what enlivens religious community is our sense of its relevance to the questions we are presently living." And what questions are we more presently living in this moment, all of us together, than the questions, sometimes world-threatening questions of climate change and environmental justice. So without further ado, I want to invite Rabbi Hannah to take to the podium and tell us what you have to say tonight.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. I bring greetings from Or Shalom, a synagogue where we pray on unceded land that has been sacred to our First Nations peoples for over 10,000 years. From the daily morning Jewish liturgy, Nishmat kol chai tevarech et shimcha. The breath of every living thing praises your name. Let's take a deep and cleansing breath. Interbreathing with our plant world. My oxygen for your my carbon dioxide for your oxygen. Joining Gaia in her praise. In the 18th century, Hasidic master Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav encouraged his followers to leave the synagogue and go out into the fields to pray. Why? Because if, God forbid, prayer didn't flow freely, they would be inspired by the song of the grasses, a song that the grasses and flowers of the fields are always singing. To be amongst them is to be uplifted by their chorus. Rabbi Nachman wrote, "Know that every shepherd has a unique melody according to the grasses of the place where he herds. Every grass has a song which it sings, and the shepherds join and embellish this song." So it was with King David, a shepherd and a musician. Coming to know the grasses' song and singing it, the shepherds give strength to the grasses so that they grow, and so that there's pasture for the animals of that place, and they have something to eat. No, that melody is made from the growth of the land. And know that when a person prays in the field, the grasses and plants of that place join in and enter the prayer. Their singing supports him and gives him the strength to pray. What a beautiful description of feelings that so many of us have, a sense of spirituality in nature. And Rabbi Nachman goes farther than to say that we humans experience our spirituality when we are immersed in the grandeur of creation. He's saying that nature herself has a soul and expresses her spirit. Rabbi Nachman's sense of nature isn't original within the Jewish canon. The biblical psalmists and prophets wrote about the sea roaring in praise, mountains and hills breaking into song, about trees clapping their hands together and shouting with joy in the blowing wind. The Zohar, Judaism's foundational work of mysticism, published in the 13th century, suggests that it is not only human beings who are created in God's image. Here's one quote: "All who wound God's work, any of God's works, wounds God's image." And here's another: "The 10 Sephirot, meaning the character traits, if you will, of God, were clothed in 10 creations on the first day. And these are heavens and earth, light and darkness, abyss and chaos, wind and water, the measure of a day and the measure of a night." In other words, the primary aspects of God's personality became manifest, embodied, physicalized in the created world. And Adam was but one likeness of God. Still in all, traditional texts from the Bible onward do overwhelmingly single human beings out as having been created with a unique power of imitatio Dei. And that's our empower to invent and create. With this divine attribute comes tremendous responsibility and grave risks to the planet and cosmos we've seen borne out by human irresponsibility, disrespect, and greed. Jewish law is called halacha, which means path, a path for walking. Here are 10 safeguards against climate crisis that halacha, the Jewish path, offers, knowing full well the insatiability of human appetites. First and foremost, we don't have unrestricted freedom to misuse creation because there's an absolute sense that nothing belongs to us. In the high holiday liturgy, we pray, the soul is yours, the body is yours, and we are mere sojourners, transients like our ancestors. Our days on earth are but a fleeting shadow. The earth is the Lord's. God's handiwork is good. Indeed, Genesis says very good, which reflects a wisdom in the order of nature, even as that wisdom is beyond human understanding. So it's presumptuous of us to alter, and all the more so irrevocably alter, that order of which we are not in charge, but rather a part. We are arms of God in the world, and we consecrate our hands every day, not taking 10 paces from the bed before washing our hands and reciting a blessing to do good work that is God's work within that day. The world is God-centered, not human-centered, and this means orienting our experience of the world as a source of wonder rather than as a resource. Observing a Sabbath mandates weekly respites from striving and utilizing and accruing. These respites are also extended to working animals, and according to the Torah, we're instructed to allow cultivated earth to rest 1 year in 7. The Torah prohibits wasteful consumption. Here's a passage from Deuteronomy. When in war against a city, do not destroy its trees, wielding an axe against them. You may eat of them, but no mic.
Yeah, we're fine.
We're fine? There's no mic.
Just the room mic.
Okay.
Cut off.
When in war against a city, don't destroy its trees, wielding an axe against them. You may eat of them, but you must not cut them down. Subsequent halacha, derived from this verse, expands to include rabbinic prohibition of the wanton destruction of household goods, clothes, buildings, springs of water, food, and the wasteful consumption of anything. We believe in the obligation to save human life. And isn't it in the name of ensuring a viable future for the next generations of our species that we must stop and reverse the climate crisis. The command is choose life. Again from Deuteronomy. I set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Choose life, that both you and your seed shall live. So pertinent. Don't do anything that will endanger generations to come. And not just human generations. The Torah prohibits our jeopardizing any species. One more time from Deuteronomy. If along the road you chance upon a bird's nest with fledglings or eggs, and the mother sitting over the fledglings or on the eggs, do not take the mother with her young. Let the mother go if you are to take the young. Taking 2 generations of life from a single species is considered risk to the survival of that species. Environmental justice is a Jewish value. Many biblical laws redress the power and economic imbalances in society and nature. Important examples are the 7th sabbatical year, in which farmed land is to lay fallow and rest. Debts are to be forgiven, and indentured slaves are to be freed. And the 50th Jubilee year, which goes so far as to call for the return of land to its original, dare I say, indigenous owner. Globalization has strived to achieve the free movement of people, information, money, goods, and services, but it's fallen terribly short of teaching us that we truly are connected as a globe, one organismic whole, that our fates are connected. So many millions have been bypassed by the benefits of globalization. Cultures disrupted, human rights violated, resources robbed, and environments destroyed. The Jewish concept of tzedek, justice, demands that we create a worldwide economy that's sustainable and that is equitable in distribution of wealth and resources. What is significant about the sabbatical and jubilee system is the ongoing and predictable resets that are prescribed. Imagine if we were to walk this walk, adjusting ecological health and social justice at expected, anticipated, and not too far off intervals. Finally, number 10, there is the mandate to partner with God in completing creation, perfecting and repairing creation, establishing a heaven right here on earth. I want to return to Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, who famously taught, if you believe that you have the capacity to be destructive, then believe that you have the capacity to repair. Early rabbinic commentary on the Bible offers a passage Jewish environmentalists are fond of quoting. When God created the first human beings, God led them around the Garden of Eden and said, "Look at my works. See how beautiful they are, how excellent. For your sake, I created them. See to it that you don't spoil and destroy my world. For if you do, there will be no one but you to repair it." repairing the world, tikkun olam, has become a major theme in modern Jewish social justice theology. In our greed, we have damaged the world and silenced many of the voices in the chorus of creation. There's no one to fix it but us. On the one hand, we're not naive. It might be too late. On the other hand, and with your permission, I bless us to be hopeful. So what gives me hope? This. Initiatives like this that pull us together in the same room, as it were, to lament, to point to the great wisdom of our traditions and share them as a composite toolbox for our equitable human flourishing as we collectively choose life. Let's take a deep cleansing breath. Interbreathing with our plant world. Interbreathing with divine images. Interbreathing with God. How uncanny that COVID attacks the ability to breathe. How uncanny that George Floyd's horrific death was a murder by choking. For here we are, living the emergency of a choking planet. Our moderators have asked me, to what do I turn when I feel discouraged? I turn and return to the breath. In returning to my breath and my exchange of breath, I return to the breath of all life. And I remember myself, as in putting myself back together, as a part of the organismic whole. The God I believe in is the flow between you and me, between me and Charlie Brown, my grand dog, me and the magnolia in my garden. The connection gives me solace. It re-inspires. If there's a Jewish creed, it's, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." To my mind, the meaning of that is everything is connected, one. Breathing, I know that, intellectually, spiritually, and physically. And this is what I teach. From that remembered connection, everything flows. I am not master, I'm part of. I am but one expression of God in this physical world. The dog and the tree are my kin. I love my neighbor as myself because sharing a single God breath, my neighbor is myself. And ultimately, we share one fate. What goes around comes around isn't just a platitude. What do I do when I feel discouraged? I reinvest in observing the Sabbath, consciously stepping back from ambitions which necessarily propel me to make use of the world to serve my purpose. Instead, I walk in the world consciously appreciating all the interactions, registering all is very good and surely beyond my comprehension. From that reset, everything flows. I know my place again. I remember that to live is holy. Existence is precious. I remember wonder. And wonder is a great tool. Wonder engenders my desire to preserve and protect. What do I do when I feel discouraged? I sing. Even when my song is full of grief, The singing arouses both body and soul. Singing, I feel power in my deepest recesses, and the vocalizing expresses that. From song practice, everything flows. I remember my effect. I remember that my expressions and action make a mark and can provoke change. These are the spiritual practices in service of acting for the sake of a livable world, in service of grounding me in the core of my human capacity to appreciate the ineffable, to feel connected to creatures and creation, and to act in making reparation to our suffering world. Judaism is very big on reparation. Some say that Adam and Eve were kicked out of the Garden of Eden because they ate from the tree. But the rabbis of the Talmud say it wasn't because they transgressed. It was rather because they refused to repent. Acknowledgement, or confession, is a first step towards repentance. But the further steps are restitution and enactment of change. So, we must believe that if we have the capacity to destroy, we also have the capacity to restore and to repair. Colonimus Kalman Shapira, the rabbi of the Warsaw Ghetto, taught that repentance is our return to the people we have not yet been. Return to the people we have not yet been, but can be, to our high dream of ourselves. Return to what we have the capacity to be. It's that capacity that this series of talks wants to harness. The God I believe in is not going to swoop in and unilaterally save us. Sustaining our world is a partnership. God never ceases breathing life into the world, and in reciprocity, we are entreated to persistently receive that gift, making daily choices to relinquish our human chauvinism, continually embracing our relationships with all creatures and with the dust we came from. We have that capacity. It's a matter of returning to the people we have not yet been. COVID disease and death has touched all of us. Atrocity against the people of this unceded land has been in recent months proven by so many decomposed little bodies. Anti-Semitism is on the rise. Just last summer and fall, heat and fire and then flood has taken 2- and 4-legged lives and destroyed crops, earth, right here at home. We're cracked open. We're tired. We're demoralized. We're desperate. And these factors make this a plastic moment, a moment of potential flexibility when our hearts are softened so that change is possible, surely more possible than when we were content. We, gathered here, are not going to emerge from the pandemic and go back to business as usual. We attend events like this to make the most of the plastic moment. There's no time for neutrality. As our great 20th century theologian, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel taught, we are either ministers to the sacred or slaves to evil. I think we're here to help one another minister to the sacred, be arms of God in the world, witness one another's struggles, celebrate one another's strides, share wisdom and teaching and visions that counter and balance business as usual. We're here to raise a collective voice in choosing life. Nishmat kol chai tevarech et shimcha. May the breath of all life praise your name.
Thank you so much. Before we get into our Q&A, I do have two little housekeeping announcements. First, people who are logged in via Eventbrite might not have access to the YouTube chat. But however, if you go to the UCV website, vancouverunitarians.ca, the link on the front page there will definitely allow you access to the chat. And please get active in that chat, sending us questions. I can't see them, but I already have some questions in my hand from our gophers, so apparently you are active there. Thank you so much. Second, I just want to apologize. We had a moment of technical confusion on our end, but thank you so much to our tech team for figuring that out. And thank you all for bearing with us. Would you like to start, Michael?
I will, thank you. And you're going to get a proper thanks at the end, but I just want to say, Rabbi Hannah, thank you so much for speaking so specifically to the themes that we're exploring here. Much appreciated. And so I think you've given us a kind of roadmap. I'd like to lead off in terms of a question at this point. You did touch on a number of things in your faith that help you think about and act around climate action. And are there two or three that you would touch on particularly, linking faith and specific actions?
I think what I would say is that Judaism isn't based on faith. Mm-hmm. It's based on action. So that to be a Jew, you don't have to believe one specific thing, but rather follow a path, a life path, a path of action. So within Judaism, action is a way of enacting Torah. If we imagine that we are given this blessing of life, and that life force streams into our world from perhaps some ineffable source, the way that we return that energy to the top again so that it could flow one more time is to raise up spirit through action.
Thank you.
So I think that's probably the most important thing for me.
Thanks so much. Olivia?
I think you've just answered some of the other questions I have here. One question that I had listening to you speak, you speak so much about the sort of embodied side of religion, about our breath, about taking things we know intellectually and actually doing them. And that's something that I know many of us struggle with around climate, because I know so many facts and numbers. But my knowing the facts and numbers doesn't help them to change, or doesn't help me to do anything about them, really. So I wondered if you could, how for you, you move from that place of knowing intellectually to knowing in a more spiritual or whole self way that allows you to act on them, instead of just being paralyzed by knowing the percentage of the glaciers that are disappearing.
Well, that is paralyzing. I think, again, in Judaism, there is a way of looking at these things that makes a difference, and that is that body, mind, and spirit are connected. That there's not this sense of like, there's the spiritual me and the bodily me, so much as the bodily me is serving the spiritual me. And so that connection is always very, I think, should be cultivated as very palpable. Head, body, and spirit is a little harder. I think it's harder for us to get out of our head. And so I'm going to speak on a personal level and say that meditation practice for me is very important. It doesn't mean that I'm shutting off my intellect. It means that I'm making space to ground myself in what I feel and who I am, and the most basic ways in which I am connected to other humans and to the planet is to just be a part of it. So there's respite from too much head in any spiritual practice. But there's also a grounding both in our bodily need. I need to be able to breathe, right? So that would propel me to action. And there is a spiritual way in which well, I think that's really my answer from before. A way of responding to my spirit is through the action. So quieting the mind is an important thing, but having the facts is also important.
And the theme of your presentation was the breath of all life, and you referenced breathing itself, and is that part of your meditation?
Yes, I think breath is very important.
Mm-hmm. Right. And taking the time to do that.
But it could also be, your running practice, your gardening practice.
Right. The in the moment practice.
The practice that brings you to earth.
Literally,
Yeah.
I suppose. I'd like to go back to something you said at the beginning, that an event like this is a way that we can start to come together to look at collectively what we're doing in choosing life. Our last speaker was Reverend Carmen Lansdowne, as you know, from First United Church. And that's a pretty activist constituency. And so the question we touched on with her is there a way, and maybe you can return to the word, I'm using the word faith again, there is a way that different religions and or faiths can come together more proactively around the climate crisis issue in some way that are demonstrating themselves. They're finding ways of collectively coming together that you touched on.
Well, I guess our last multi-faith action around climate was the Green Faith prayer circle that happened before the UN climate conference. And so participating in things like that are super important.
Right.
Yeah.
Not everyone will know what that was. Could you just describe it?
It was a gathering of an interfaith gathering, an outdoor park with prayer and speakers, and people came in their religious garb or their,
Right. Good.
But I think it's also the activism within communities that's important. I spoke about taking solace in individual spiritual practice or a practice that's of an individual nature in community. But there's also the practice of literally, writing letters and going to actions that is, I think, gives us hope. When we look around and our communities, yours does, ours does, we call ours a Tikkun Olam, Repair of the World committee, and they will write to the community every couple of weeks with what actions shall we, take part in, what letters need to be written. And we try to weave a sense of environmentalism into everything that we do. So it's important to take solace as individuals, but it's also very important to have a community that is moving forward towards some redress of our crisis.
Indeed. I'll have a question, a follow-up around the topic of hope in a moment, but I see that Olivia has a question.
Oh, well, I was just going to say that a question from the chat is very related. Are there particular actions that your congregation is encouraged to do, such as advocacy campaigns or demonstrations to change policy or individual action like recycling? So maybe you could speak to some specifics of...
So I don't know that I can speak to... I can speak to categories of things,
Yes.
So going to political actions, going to demonstrations, writing letters. People in the community are advised as to what is it that we are working on in this moment? What are we advised to write about and to whom on a regular basis? And we also do quite a bit of study around eco-Judaism, around the kinds of topics that I talked about very briefly in the talk. We just finished a series on eco-Kabbalah, which was a lunchtime sort of learning series. We released a series of poems written by a forester and a friend of Or Shalom in January to be taken on a nature walk. So go into the woods, take these poems with you. They're about, they reference beautiful verses in the canon and bring them into the forest. And so there are different ways in which we want to stimulate people to take action, political action, but also actions that bring people in contact with themselves and nature and begin to stimulate that desire. So it's in a way kind of like a great barn raising. We're all putting it up, and we each have a specific task that we are born to do. So some people's task is going to be to write the letter. Some people's task is going to be to get arrested. Some people's task is going to be to write the poetry that arouses wonder, that causes a person to say, I'm going to stop using plastic bottles.
I have a follow-up here that's come through, if I may. I think we're going to have to extend the evening when you hear this question. How do we get past the divisiveness of the world?
By recognizing that what goes around comes around. Our great activist rabbi, and his work is primarily in climate and ecological activism, Rabbi Arthur Waskow, says that we create the kind of God that we experience. If we pollute, if we put pollutants into our environment, we will experience a God that doesn't allow the crops to yield. If we promote injustice of any kind, we will engender a God of war that's full of hatred. And so I think that recognizing that we are not, there's no such thing on a certain level as privilege. It is something that we definitely destroy by thinking that we are privileged. But in the end, it's all one fate. And the sooner we realize that we are all part of the same organismic whole, the better we'll be.
And that speaks to the issue of, or the question of divisiveness.
Yes.
More we are. Thank you. Did you have one?
Yeah, I did. Another of my personal questions, because I'm the one who's moderating, so I get to feed in as many of my questions as I want. One of the wonderful things about this series is that we get to hear from so many different faith backgrounds. You know, I grew up in a Unitarian congregation, this Unitarian congregation, and one of the most fascinating things that I have heard both in your talk and in what was shared by Reverend Carmen Lansdowne, who of course is coming from the United Church, is I don't have that much experience with traditions in which the central creator God is very important and is the center of so much religious life. Unitarians are all across the board on their relationship to God. I want to ask you to speak more about the idea that many of us who do not come from a God-based tradition have, that there is nature and then there is us. Whereas you are speaking all the time about how God's creation is one singular whole, and that there is not us and then the beautiful natural world that we besmirch. There is one whole. And I want to ask you how that idea affects your understanding of climate, coming from this different religious background.
Are you asking me how my belief that humans and the natural world are all part of one thing affects my notions of climate?
I think so, and of our relationship to the climate crisis.
I think that it's, instead of saying we are destroying it, we are destroying ourselves. And that's why the mandate to preserve human life is at the center of our attitude towards climate. By destroying our world, we're destroying ourselves. I mean, I think we would all agree with that. So,
No, you finish. If I may just pursue that to the extent. So if I'm a person that's not coming from a God-centered, I might be an atheist, for example, how does my worldview fit into this climate issue and the question of the themes we've been exploring of the relationship between nature and humans and all living things, and thinking holistically, if you will?
I don't know how to speak as an atheist, but I'm not talking about, I'm not talking about a faraway God. I mean, there are many faces of God. There are many ways to talk about God, even just within Judaism. God is super multifaceted, but there is also the sense that I spoke about of God as being the connective tissue in that oneness. So maybe that would be comfortable for an atheist. I might use the word God, but it has to do with relationship, the space between, the energy between us.
I think that's a really important word, and relationship and the energy.
I just want to say one other thing about that. It's kind of like, you could think of it as we desecrate the world, we're desecrating those membranes, or like the chi, you know, we're destroying the chi, the energy, and that is a way of talking about God, and it has to do with, you know, our destruction of everything.
Because the theme is that we are all related. All living things are related. And whatever perspective we bring.
It just brings to mind, I work with the kids here, and there was one child who was obsessed with the issue of highways cutting through environmental landscapes and making it impossible for the creatures living on either side of the highway to interact as they would have in an untouched natural environment. And it's like that kid's idea, that obsession that one 8-year-old had one year. It's like that on a much, much larger scale, that we have to think of literal relationship, but in our spiritual lives, there is another form of relationship that we rely on. Thank you.
You have a background in arts. You're an artist. And it seems to me that the arts have a huge role to play in communicating and in tapping into the theme that we're exploring here, which is tapping into people's deepest feelings, their aspirations and their anxieties. Could you talk a little bit about the connection between art and climate and resilience? And also, of course, it's expressed through arts and culture in religion too.
Well, we could talk about arts in service of, right? Arts as harnessed in the way that religion can also be harnessed to bring to the fore the important issues of our moment. But we can also talk about art, like I talked about breathing, as the way to process and the way to, you know, allow what's happening in the world to filter through us and find the points of resonance that are going to rise up, perhaps into action. And I would say that that is the same function that prayer might serve.
Right. Indeed, they're very closely aligned, I would think. I'd like to return, I know our time now is, we're getting there. I'd like to return to the subject of hope. And you've touched on this, but maybe if you could just expand a little bit. How do I deal with the feeling of saying, but I'm only one? What place has hope in that, if you will?
Yeah. So in the Jewish tradition, we have a proverb, it is not yours to complete the task, nor can you desist from it. And I think that speaks to your question. We have to act as individuals and as individual communities and as communities interacting with one another. But we also recognize that we're not going to, none of us are going to solve it on our own or in our organizations. And that the hope is that this turnover, I think, in religious community and in conscious community of really standing up to business as usual, that we see it more and more, we watch it spread, and we know that we can't do it alone, but it's happening out there. And we look at our children and we see how differently one generation lives from the one in the past. You know, my kids by absolutely knew anything. You know, and my parents were just beginning to have money, right? And spending it. So we have hope by looking at the way that we've taught our children and that the way that they're rising up to meet the challenge. I also think it's important, one of the things we do is we support an organization of teens that work on climate. And it's very important to empower kids to be working for the world that they're going to inherit. I see all of that as hopeful. Watching the spread of movements of change in paradigm, and watching our children grow up with different values, such better values.
You know, that it's so important. What excites me about what you're saying is that, in a sense, it's presumptuous for me to say, well, I'm only going to act if I get the result. What we're doing, as you're describing it, when I think of hope, is we're creating the conditions by which there can be ever-expanding possibilities to be doing things. Yes. And we'll never necessarily know what our own specific contribution was, but we have the satisfaction of contributing to the momentum, if you will.
And that is part of getting our egos out of the way. That's part of checking our chauvinism.
Expand on that for a moment.
You know, I think that one of the things that we're called upon to do is to check our chauvinism in the sense that, you know, this mountain is ours to mine, right? This land is ours to overwork. But there's also the chauvinism of this is mine to solve.
Agreed.
I do have a question that you've already spoken to just now, to much of this, but how do you experience the response of younger members to the climate crises?
I think there's a lot of despair. And so that's where spiritual practice is helpful. And also just in like doing stuff, like where yesterday we had a site visit to prepare to install a food pantry in back of our property. You know, so just empowering people to have smaller and larger roles, keep it rolling out, keep the information coming of where we can stand up, where we can act, and balancing that with many portals for entry into a quieting and a restorative practice, whatever it's going to be. Sort of both and.
Another question I have here is, what personal experience has inspired your focus and energy on climate justice?
I think recently the most powerful experience for me was having visited the beautiful land of a member of our community in the prairies, and a few months later, hearing his report of that land burning and the wild horses running and the, you know, and really recognizing that a place that I had been and found so incredibly beautiful was aflame. I mean, those things happen over and over, but that's the most recent one I can think of.
For many of us, you mentioned the heat dome and the floods and the fires. For many of us, climate has long been something we, especially in Canada, are able to isolate ourselves from, and our ability to do so is shrinking now.
That's a good thing.
Yes.
It's not a good thing that the climate is changing. It's a good thing that we're being hit over the head, you know, because I do think that there has to be a point at which we hit some kind of rock bottom where people get it. It's an emergency, and then we're going to act like it's an emergency. And if we act like an emergency, we will make a change. We'll go through the bottom if we have to. Now, I think of the story of Hagar out in the desert, and she has no water, and she has no hope, and she realizes that the patriarchy in which she lived has abandoned her. She's there with her son, he's dying, and she hits the bottom. And it's in that moment that she sees a way forward, that she sees a well. And that's my interpretation. But hitting bottom is not a bad thing. It means we're going to be more flexible because we're desperate.
The plastic moment.
We've covered a range of ground tonight. The content of your presentation has been just terrific. And the themes that we've been able to explore in this conversation. If we have no more questions coming in, I think what I'm going to try to do is just give a bit of a summary and see how it fits with you and with Olivia, and what message we're sending to the world out there tonight from this conversation. We've touched on the individual, how I as a person experience and engage the climate crisis. So we've talked about breathing and meditation, and we've also talked about singing. A great idea. I'm all for it as long as I can join in, not lead. So that led us to discussing the collective and how the best way of acting on our concerns is by coming together. And we are generating hope for each of us by building a larger aspiration and hope through the kind of collective action that we've been talking about. And there are many ways of doing that, and the arts become part of it. And through our beliefs, this is the way we can express ourselves. And then, as Olivia said, you suggested we're at a plastic moment. And that includes maybe that we're bottoming out and we've got nowhere to go but up. And you said, we need to be realistic. We don't know the outcome of this, but this is how we need to approach it. And I so much appreciate that. And the fact that you have the stern reminder that we have to park our hubris and our chauvinism at the door and be able to work out beyond that. So for all of those things, and I've just touched on some of your points, I found it a very rich evening. But would you have some final comments, you and also Olivia, that you'd like to share?
I think I would just say that the most important thing in this beautiful place where we live is to engage it, to be outside, to be touched by what we don't understand, by the grandeur of it all, and to allow ourselves to be inspired, not be jaded, but be inspired, and to think about our children, to think about the fact that they're inheriting this world, and we have to choose life for ourselves and for generations that come. And I think it's important to grab the flexible moment, particularly right now. This is what we've got. We're coming out of a pandemic. We can go back to the way it was, or we can go to be the people that we haven't been yet. And I find that very inspiring. To repent is to return to the person that I have not yet been. So I offer that as a blessing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, indeed. Olivia?
Yeah, thank you so much for spending this evening with us, and thanks for Michael for summarizing. A few quick reminders to those at home. There is an email address. It is our team member, Derek. So that's moc@vancouverunitarians.ca. That is the email to use if you have comments or questions on the series going forward. I believe that will be on a slide, so you don't have to worry if you didn't catch me saying it. Also, our next speaker in March will be Sukhvinder Kaur Vinning, a leader within the Sikh faith in the Lower Mainland, Wednesday, March 9th. And we have more events booked through April and May. We're going to be continuing this series. So thank you so much to all our volunteers. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Rabbi Hannah, so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was splendid.
Thank you so much.
I hope